Good day. My name is Paul Wax. I'm the Executive Director of the American College of Medical Toxicology, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar series entitled Medical and Public Health Considerations of COVID-19. Today, we have two outstanding and extremely timely presentations. The first presentation will be on global COVID-19 epidemiology and lessons learned from lifting mitigation strategies. And the second presentation will be a research update on Remdesivir. Next slide. I'd like to thank all of our webinar series partners, and I'd also like to particularly thank our newest partner, the Emergency Nurses Association, which is joining us this week, moving forward as one of our partnering societies. Next slide. These webinars are all recorded and posted to the ACMT website. In approximately 48 hours, you'll be receiving an email to this effect and the exact link. Our general webinar presentations on the COVID-19 series is at acmt.net/COVID-19 web. And any particular questions about this series can be addressed to info@acmt.net. Next slide. We will have a question and answer period toward the end of the webinar. In order to participate, please either text in your questions in the Q&A function or the chat function of the WebEx platform. And if you're on YouTube or Facebook, you can use the chat function there to also chat in some questions. Next slide. None of the speakers have any conflicts of interest to disclose. Next slide. I'd like to thank my co-moderator, Dr. Charles McKay. He's the past president of the American College of Medical Toxicology, and will be helping out with the moderation of the Q&A toward the end of the presentation today. Next slide. It is my delight to introduce our first speaker. Dr. Benjamin Dahl is the Deputy for Science of the COVID-19 International Task Force. He works at the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, is really in the midst of the public health response to this pandemic. This is a extraordinarily timely presentation and is very much up to date. I think you'll all enjoy it. And this presentation, again, is on the global COVID-19 epidemiology and lessons learned from lifting mitigation strategies. Dr. Dahl.
Thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be here. As I said, my name is Ben Dahl. I'm an epidemiologist at CDC, and we'll be covering some of the lessons learned from the mitigation strategies globally. And this information was prepared by the International Task Force and other mitigation teams. So I'm just going to briefly run through some of the historical trends and then get into some more depth on some of the other topics. This figure shows the number of new cases reported per day by WHO region from January 11th through July 7th. The earliest cases were in the Western Pacific, followed by a surge of cases in Europe. Currently, the Americas account for the largest proportion of cases being reported. However, it is worth noting that Southeast Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean region have seen consistent increase in reported number of cases. This map shows the COVID-19 cases worldwide between April 13th and April 27th. The red circles represent the number of cases reported from each country over these 2 weeks, and the color of each country represents the incident rate over the same 2-week period. So just briefly look at this and then contrast it with the next slide, which shows the period from June 22nd to July 6th. And this shows a shifting of the epidemic. This map shows the recent incidence rates that are highest in the Americas, but that there are also countries with high incidence rates in Europe and Central Asia, such as Sweden, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Moldova, also in Africa, so South Africa, and the Middle East, primarily in Oman and Saudi Arabia. Overall case counts also remain very high in the Americas. What this shows is the incident rates per population of 100,000 by WHO region. So according to WHO, as of today, there have been more than 13 million cases of COVID-19 worldwide. This figure shows the incident rates or cases per 100,000 population, as I said, by WHO region. So you have to note, though, the different y-axes necessitated a wide variability in the incidence rates across the region. So from more than 9 cases per 100,000 population in Tahoe to less than 0.1 cases per 100,000 in Whitworth. You see these on these axes here. The Tahoe in the top center, the top row center, is still in a very strong growth phase and accounts for the majority of new and cumulative cases and deaths. So Brazil and the US have reported the most cases. Chile has recently emerged as a country with the greatest incidence in the region. EMRO in the top right reported case counts beginning to plateau in mid-June. However, incidence rates in some countries are on par with those being reported in the highly affected Tahoe region. And we have some concerns that the upcoming Hajj later this month may further impact epidemiology in this region. Saudi Arabia has recently restricted the event to several thousand pilgrims, down from the annual 2.5 million. In this figure, each bubble is a country. It might be a little tough to see, but when the slides are distributed, you can look at it more in depth. The size of the bubble represents the number of cases reported in the last 2 weeks, so from June 22nd to July 6th. The y-axis is the country's incidence rate per 100,000 population over the last 2 weeks, and the x-axis is the country's current reproductive number. The vertical dashed gray line represents an R equal to 1. Countries to the right of this line, where R is greater than 1, may be experiencing growing outbreaks. So a country's location in this scatter plot demonstrates a couple of things. It demonstrates the current intensity of the outbreak using case incidence in the last 2 weeks, and the potential trajectory of the outbreak using the reproductive number along the x-axis. So for example, Brazil, which is in a large pink bubble, and USA, which is in a large pink bubble, have high incidence rates during the last 2 weeks. And they also have an R that is greater than 1, indicating that there's likely continued accumulation of cases in the near term. So ideally, with a global control, like all countries would find themselves as small circles located in the bottom left of the figure. But because because sometimes few cases are reported in the last 2 weeks, you could also see something where incidence could be low and R could be less than 1, which might indicate that there is control of the outbreak, but it could also indicate problems with reporting. And unfortunately, many countries still find themselves located to the right side of the plot. This slide, we'd like to show where we would look at the case fatality proportion, the testing, the age, just kind of a commentary. Early in the pandemic, there was a lot of discussion about case fatality proportions. And we had a wide range of reporting of case fatality proportions from less than 1% to over 10%. Or testing practices could explain some of those differences, since some countries were testing only severe cases, which would lead to a higher reported case fatality proportion. But even after accounting for the age differences among cases, we found that countries with a high percentage of testing positive tended to also have a higher reported case fatality proportion. So you might see how older age groups that had been reported in the media in Italy and France were succumbing, but again, the caveats that I had just mentioned. So here we want to do something, comparing the mortality burden of COVID-19 to influenza. And this is as of about a month ago, but we continue to try to update this. So on this slide, we're again using our incidence rate of 100,000 population. So specifically, we're looking at the mortality rate ratio. So a rate ratio of greater than 1 would indicate that the country has a higher death rate from COVID as compared to influenza. And the number of COVID-19 deaths, this is from Johns Hopkins information, the JHU information that's widely accessible, and covers deaths reported through June 4th. So for deaths due to influenza, we're also looking at a paper, we're citing a paper that was published in 2018 that uses a statistical model to estimate the average excess mortality associated with influenza. This was from a period of 1999 to 2015. And the reference is here to the right if you want to look that paper up afterwards. So it's important to note that influenza estimates are modeled estimates and are limited by the availability of vital records and vital surveillance, especially in Africa, Eastern Mediterranean, Southeast Asia, and other low-income countries, and possibly countries of the tropical climate. So now just getting back to the slide, we're showing the mortality rate ratio of each country. Again, those are very small, but you can look at it later. And what is highlighted in bold text here. So most countries with a high rate ratio are from the European region or the Americas, with very few countries from the Eastern Mediterranean region. And really what we want to point out is that the highest rate ratio was in Italy. So you can see that you had an excess mortality that was approximately 13 times greater due to COVID than what would be the average number of annual deaths due to influenza. So this is something also to think about as we go towards the fall here, at least in the US, when we get into our influenza season. Next, I'm going to jump into some just overall mortality surveillance and some other analyses we are doing. So I reported the overall number of cases earlier, reported by WHO. We've also, this week, we've reported 570,000 reported deaths. We do believe that the number of reported deaths are likely underreported. So when here we're doing some analyses on excess death statistics, what this could really provide for us is about some information about the burden of mortality that's potentially related to COVID-19. And excess deaths are calculated as the difference between the observed number of deaths and the expected number of deaths over the same period. So what you see in this graphic are that excess deaths as a percentage of expected deaths between February 1st and June 1st. This is for just looking at 21 countries. And you can just see there's just an immense range of excess deaths across the country, from a high of over 80% excess deaths in Ecuador to a low of negative 10% for Israel. And there's also a lot of variability within the region. So, for example, Ecuador and Peru have high levels of excess mortality with 85 and 55% of excess deaths, respectively, whereas Brazil and Chile have levels around 10%. So we think that some of these excess deaths may be recorded as either due to COVID, but there's other factors that could also be in play here. So potentially some of the mitigation measures, maybe that could be protecting some of the vulnerable populations, could also be showing access to health infrastructure or lack of access to health infrastructure. And demographics could really range over here too. And there could be some protective measures from some of the stay-at-home measures that a lot of countries have put in. So, for example, maybe fewer deaths related to road accidents or other deaths like that. So in here, we just it's also breaking it down a little bit by their different regions. So we look at South America, continental Europe, and Scandinavia. And this shows it shows the excess deaths as a percentage of expected deaths by weeks for several of the countries. You can look at the table and figure out the countries that are based on color. So in South America, as I mentioned, Ecuador, we have which is the green line in the left figure, has an extremely high overall excess mortality, but this was largely due to a spike in the weekly excess mortality of over 350% observed in April, followed by a steady decline to around 38% in the next weeks. So shortly after Ecuador's first reported cases, there were a number of media reports that indicated that the overall health system was overwhelmed with cases and deaths. So that could be what we're observing there, and that it would decline as the health system caught up to speed. In continental Europe, which is the middle figure, it seems like the excess deaths really peaked in early to mid-April, and followed by a steady decline to below 0% in the beginning of June. Whereas in Scandinavia, it's a more mixed picture with many countries now below their baseline, but Sweden still remaining elevated. We also want to look at monitoring excess mortality in resource-limited settings, realizing that not all countries have the same amount of resources, say, as a Scandinavian country, or some of the other European countries. And so we wanted to look at mortality surveillance, and we realized that there are a lot of challenges with that, again, probably due to resources or the overall health system. And so what the map here is showing is that where we have information about death information. So which countries are reporting death information? And you can see there are a large number of countries in Africa that aren't really reporting regular death information. In many of these countries, these are in the sub-Saharan Africa, there are areas that actually the CDC provides support. And so we've been trying to work with these countries on ways to find alternate sources for mortality data. So both from health facilities and also community sources. And globally right now, in all countries, WHO and CDC is advocating for what we call rapid mortality surveillance. And so that's something we can look at as a set of variables for each death that is reported. And if we can build on existing systems, this approach can really provide decision makers for the information that they're going to need about both direct and indirect impacts of this pandemic, and how we could potentially target control measures. In the table to the right, it's showing an example from Zambia where rapid mortality surveillance efforts are underway. And the figure, what it's showing is an improvement in the Lusaka district. Lusaka is the capital of Zambia, where death registration has doubled from 45 to 90% over the last 5 years. So really trying to improve what the information they have. And the figures showing that the number of deaths by week for those 60 years of age or older, you have your historic baseline, which is an orange, so just kind of going right in there in the middle. And also then we have the blue, the 2020 deaths in solid blue. So using the existing mortality reporting process, we had a spike of deaths starting in March of 2020, which was flagged for further investigation by the authorities. And we do recognize that there's a lag time in death reporting, and the Zambian government recognized that. And so what they're doing is trying to implement improvements to this rapid mortality surveillance to improve both the timeliness and completeness of reporting across the country. And that's just kind of what we're trying to show in this slide. So now I'm going to pivot a little bit to mitigation strategies and the lifting of mitigation strategies, particularly in the European context. So we're here in this table, we're showing that which countries achieved a 50% decrease in their daily incidence before lifting their mitigation measures. And so mitigation, maybe we're talking about stay-at-home measures. And you can see that in green, and it's mostly in Western Europe, but most of those countries waited until they had met a 50% reduction before lifting those mitigation measures. In red, and those are primarily in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, many of those countries had not met the mitigation or the 50% decrease in daily incidence before lifting those measures. So how did this play out? Well, we found that while most countries have lifted their mitigation measures in that region, looking at the overall analysis, it's countries that started lifting measures after achieving a 50% decline, and those are the countries in the upper level. All of those countries continue more or less to have a low number of cases or incidents. Among countries that did not wait, those are the graphic in the bottom. There's been mixed results. When we see some cases, such as Poland, see their cases rising after lifting the mitigation measures. And just going back, I'm rushing a little bit, but in the middle here, this is where it's zero is when countries have lifted their mitigation measures. So day zero from when they've lifted their mitigation measures. Again, most of that, the take home is that most countries that wait until having a large reduction in their cases until they lift mitigation measures have remained relatively low. So there are some limitations, though. So I don't want to say everything is great. Surveillance capacity there's a wide range of surveillance capacity across the countries. So it's sometimes making a comparison between one country and another can be a challenge. Often what we find is that the date of the report is maybe there's a lag. Maybe it's not always this date of symptom onset or the date of the exposure. So that can, again, lead to differences between the countries. And the mitigation measures were also slightly different. And so the results in country with the level of compliance and duration was slightly different. So we do feel there's some limitations to this. Mitigation measures also have a role in school reopenings. And that's something that here in the US is being talked about quite a bit right now. So I want to just present a few aspects from our global experience. Most of the US schools have been closed for the majority of the outbreak here in the US, whereas in some of our global settings in other countries, they have reopened and have had experience of schools being open during the pandemic. So, according to UNESCO, as of June 25th, 2020, 194 schools in countries, 194 countries and territories have closed their schools as a result of the pandemic. And of those, 116 remain closed. This is as of June 25th. And so there's over 1 billion learners worldwide who continue to be affected by school closures. We found that 78 countries have started to allow reopening, and some of those you can see from they have a range from localized reopening, those are some in pink, to nationwide reopenings, which are the schools noted in blue. So schools that have reopened, we've also seen cases in schools. And of those, at least 10 countries have listed, and these are the ones noted in red, have listed that schools have reopened and that they've seen cases either in primary schools, secondary schools, or universities since their reopening. Again, all these would be considered like an outbreak because it's happening in a school. But many of these outbreaks have been relatively small, with 10 or fewer students. But some of these have happened within 2 days of schools reopening. And there are quite a range of reactions from the different countries and the different municipalities to how they react to having an outbreak in a school. And so some of the schools have just decided to quarantine the whole affected population, so meaning the students, the teachers, or maybe just a classroom. Some countries have decided to close the entire school or reclose it after reopening. Sometimes this has led to closings of all the schools in the region, and also some countries have decided that this would make school return optional. Few different examples, concrete examples. In Canada, there was an elementary school where they returned to in-school in-person classes in May. And in the next few weeks, there were more than 40 cases among the students and staff. And the response there was to temporarily close the school. And that's primarily because of the infections in the teachers. But most of the other schools were not closed. However, in Australia, Schools reopened in the beginning of May, and first allowing students to attend 1 day a week before returning full time. And a number of cases were tested, did become positive there, and the reaction was to have kind of wide-scale school closure. And now I'm just going to pass through these pretty quickly. These are just some headlines from other examples globally where we've had school reopenings. South Korea has been in the press a lot. They've had phased reopenings. They've also had dozens of schools closed within hours of reopening just because of new infections. So what are some of the different strategies that have been employed? There are some school districts that have said they want to have personal control, so have cloth face coverings, have enhanced washing of hands. You could have administrative controls such as temperature checks or splitting up the classrooms into cohorts, maybe staggering lunchtime or playtime, having part-time virtual classes or alternate schedules, and then regular disinfecting of the classrooms. There could be engineering control. So this picture is showing some desk dividers and having different ways you could physically try to limit exposure. And then public health control. So monitoring, are there outbreaks going on in the nearby schools? And in Europe, again, it's been a wide range of different policies. I won't read through all of this. You can look at these later, but you have just a range from how one would react to it, how would one continue classes, maybe having temporary suspension of schools or having suspension of some of the maybe more like physical activities, physical classes. So there's a wide range of possibilities, and we are continuing to look at these to see what kind of lessons learned could be applied here in the U.S. I think I'm on to my last slide here. So what this graph is really showing is, the daily number of COVID cases reported in the European countries and then adjusted for when mitigation efforts were taken in place, and also when the results were relaxed. And it shows that depending on when the countries relaxed their mitigation strategy, you had this drop in cases, and how that could play a role into when schools reopen. And so, again, there's some information out there that WHO and their Eurosystem are trying to make this information accessible, and at the CDC, we continue to look at this. And I'd just like to acknowledge all my collaborators. Thank you.
Next slide. Yeah, thank you very much for really an excellent presentation and extremely timely. And I know there's a lot of questions in the queue regarding your talk, and we'll get to them in a few minutes after we complete the next presentation. Next slide. So it's my delight to introduce and welcome back our next speaker. Dr. Matthew Davis is an infectious disease pharmacist at the UCLA Ronald Reagan Medical Center in Los Angeles. Dr. Davis presented to us early on. It was in early April when everyone was locked down, and there was a lot of attention to hydroxychloroquine back then, and Remdesivir had been touted as a possible treatment remedy. And now several months have gone by. There have been some trials that have released some data, and Dr. Davis has been gracious enough to come back and provide us an update on the Remdesivir research. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Excellent. So thanks for having me back. I'm going to be going through some of the updates since the last time I spoke at ACMT. So previously we reviewed the pharmacology, safety, the preclinical data for Remdesivir, as well as some of the case reports that were published early on into the course of the pandemic. Today I'm going to be discussing two of the trials that have been highly influential in our clinical decision-making for Remdesivir therapy. First, the NIAID-sponsored ACTT-1 trial, And then secondly, the Gilead-sponsored Simple 1 Severe trial. Just as an FYI, this is essentially an abbreviated version of a larger presentation on Remdesivir. And if you're interested in seeing the full presentation, you can visit sidp.org/COVID-19, and there's a link to the video there. So first, we have the preliminary results from the ACTT-1 trial published in the New England Journal of Medicine. This is essentially the largest placebo-controlled study for Remdesivir to date. For background, these results were generated after an interim analysis was conducted following full enrollment of the target sample size. But not all patients had completed their final 28-day follow-up at the time of publication. So this study was structured to compare 10 days of Remdesivir to placebo for COVID-19 of varying degrees of severity. 1,107 patients were assessed for eligibility, and 1,063 patients were randomized in a 1-to-1 fashion to Remdesivir or placebo. For the Remdesivir arm, 541 patients were randomized, 391 or 73% had completed the study at the time of publication, and then 538 patients were analyzed in the final sample. So patient characteristics were well matched between the groups. The median age for patients was around 59 years for both groups, and patients were predominantly male. Median duration of symptoms for both arms was 9 days, with an interquartile range of 6 to 12 days for the Remdesivir arm, and these are symptoms prior to randomization to therapy. For baseline clinical status, the most common baseline category was category 5, or patients requiring low-flow oxygen supplementation, making up about 40% of the patients in both arms. This was followed by category 7, or patients requiring mechanical ventilation and or ECMO, which comprised 23% of the Remdesivir arm and slightly more in the placebo arm at 28%. Importantly, analyses were stratified for baseline clinical status to account for these slight differences between baseline clinical status. So the primary outcome for this study was time to clinical recovery, which was defined as categories 1 through 3 on an 8-point ordinal scale. These were patients that were discharged with or without limitations on their daily activity, and then also patients who remained hospitalized but no longer required ongoing medical care, primarily kept inpatient for infection control purposes. So for the primary outcome, Remdesivir significantly reduced time to clinical recovery with a median time of 11 days versus 15 days and a rate ratio of recovery of 1.32. An analysis adjusting for baseline clinical status demonstrated nearly an identical rate ratio of 1.31. And then also below, you can see the Kaplan-Meier curves for both arms, which show a consistent separation between Remdesivir and placebo, which begins within the first week of therapy and persists throughout the follow-up interval. So the authors did conduct several pre-specified subgroup analyses to attempt to further pinpoint which groups benefited from Remdesivir therapy the most. Interestingly, patients presenting with greater than 10 days of antecedent symptoms still appeared to benefit from Remdesivir therapy with a recovery rate ratio of 1.38. And this is notable because prior studies had suggested that benefit with Remdesivir was really maximized when patients were initiated within 10 days of symptom onset, but it did not really appear to affect outcomes in this trial. So here we have the recovery Kaplan-Meier curves broken down by patient baseline oxygen category. So looking at these figures, we can see that the most apparent separation between arms was observed in the patients who required low-flow oxygen supplementation at baseline. Just a few quick points that I'd like to highlight here. First, we can see that the confidence intervals are much wider in the other groups besides the low-flow oxygen supplementation groups. And this is because these groups were considerably smaller than the low-flow oxygen group. Second, a test of interaction between baseline clinical status and clinical outcome was performed, and it did not yield significant results, suggesting that the treatment effects was not significantly impacted by baseline clinical status. Third, the median time to recovery could not be estimated for patients who were mechanically ventilated at baseline due to the protracted course of their illness and the fact that a large proportion of patients had yet to finish the 28-day follow-up period at the time that these results were published. So despite these considerations, it is difficult not to notice that there seems to be really no apparent benefit or separation between the curves in the patients in both the high flow and the mechanical ventilation or ECMO groups. You can see the curves on the right and also on the bottom there. So this figure is a graphical representation of day 15 clinical status broken down by baseline oxygen requirements. Categories are represented with a color spectrum, with the leftmost categories in shades of red representing worse outcomes, and then conversely blue shades on the right representing better outcomes. I think the most meaningful information that can be taken away from this figure is the proportion of patients that worsened from their baseline category to day 15 clinical status. So I've highlighted those rates for you. So just looking at each of the individual categories, in the ambient air group, the proportion of patients that worsened was 8.3% for remdesivir versus 15.7% for placebo. A larger separation was seen for the low flow group, 8.7 versus 21.8%. And then this narrowed slightly with the high flow group with 25.4 versus 33.7, and virtually disappeared in the mechanically ventilated or ECMO patients with 13.9 versus 16.5% of patients worsening from their baseline clinical status to their day 15 clinical status. So looking towards mortality outcomes, in the overall population, there was a non-statistically significant reduction in day 14 mortality between remdesivir and placebo, with the Kaplan-Meier estimates being 7.1 versus 11.9% respectively. Now, despite this difference not reaching statistical significance, it's difficult to overlook the clinically significant difference in mortality between groups. Final follow-up data or day 28 mortality data will help aid in the interpretation of these results and remdesivir's effect on mortality. So for safety from this trial, remdesivir was well tolerated in the study compared to placebo, with actually a higher rate of adverse events being observed in the placebo arm, which highlights the high morbidity of the underlying disease process of COVID. Notably, acute kidney injury occurred at a similar rate between the arms, and transaminase elevations were observed more frequently in the placebo arms. And these are both two adverse events that have been monitored for with remdesivir therapy due to preclinical data. So take-home points from the Act 1 trial. First, remdesivir significantly reduced time to recovery, making it the first proven therapy for COVID-19, and then also garnering it the standard of care designation in the process. This benefit was similar in baseline adjusted analysis, and recovery was most apparent in patients beginning in baseline category 5 or low flow oxygen supplementation. Whether it was due to relatively higher enrollment in this baseline category or simply these patients benefit most from remdesivir therapy is still yet to be determined. As mentioned previously, there was no apparent benefit observed in patients who required mechanical ventilation or ECMO at baseline. And this is complicated by the potentially inadequate follow-up duration for this subset of patients. So we're really looking towards the final publication to understand its benefit or lack of benefit in this group. Also, patients presenting with greater than 10 days from symptom onset appear to derive benefit, which dispels the notion that a firm 10-day cutoff should be used for treatment allocation decisions. For mortality, there was no significant reduction in mortality observed, but arguably a clinically significant reduction. And then it is also important to remember that these data were generated from preliminary analyses. And at the time of data freeze, 301 patients were continuing and had not yet recovered. Lastly, safety data were promising, with a lower rate of adverse events observed in the remdesivir arm than placebo, and it was well tolerated overall. So moving on to the next trial, the Simple 1 Severe study. This was a Gilead-sponsored trial comparing 5 days versus 10 days of remdesivir therapy in patients with an oxygen saturation of 94% or lower on ambient air or requiring some form of supplemental oxygen. Patients requiring mechanical ventilation and or ECMO or those experiencing multi-organ dysfunction syndrome were excluded, but a few still made it into the study. 397 patients were randomized and started therapy, 200 in the 5-day group, and then also 197 in the 10-day group. So looking at baseline characteristics for the study, patients in both groups were similar in age. There was a slightly higher proportion of male patients in the 10-day group, 60 versus 68%. And there was a significant difference in baseline clinical status between the two groups, with the 10-day group having a higher proportion of patients in the high flow and also mechanically ventilated or ECMO patients. But despite this being a statistically significant difference in baseline clinical status, analyses were adjusted for this, so it was accounted for in their final statistics. So the primary outcome for this trial was day 14 clinical status as assessed by a 7-point ordinal scale on the left, which is similar to those used in previous studies, except the severity ranking is flipped, meaning that death is category 1 and higher ordinal categories are actually better outcomes in this study. The results of the primary outcome analysis did not show a significant difference between 5 and 10 days of treatment duration for remdesivir, and this does have significant clinical implications considering the limited overall availability of remdesivir currently with manufacturing issues and then also just global supply. Looking at secondary outcomes, there was no significant difference detected in either time to improvement, which was defined as a 2-point reduction in ordinal scale score, or time to recovery, defined as being a score of 6 or 7 between the two groups. The authors did conduct a post hoc analysis that examined if there was any benefit of 5 additional days of therapy, or in other words, doses 6 through 10 for patients grouped by their oxygen support requirements on day 5. So for patients that required invasive mechanical ventilation at day 5, 17% that received 5 additional days of therapy died by day 14, whereas 40% that received no additional therapy died by day 14. However, this is in direct contrast of an opposite trend in outcomes observed in patients requiring high flow oxygen support at day 5, with 15% death by day 14 in the patients receiving an additional 5 days of therapy versus 10% mortality in those who received no additional therapy. This analysis really should be considered with several different caveats, including that it was conducted in a post hoc fashion. The subgroups were relatively small, and the sample size in overall was actually a relatively small study. And then there was inconsistent trends across the groups, and I really caution readers against relying heavily on these data to inform allocation and treatment decisions. So take-home points for this study. No significant difference was detected in outcomes between 5 days and 10 days of therapy. Patients who were mechanically ventilated or on ECMO at day 5 who received an additional 5 days of therapy had a lower mortality rate by day 14 than those who received no additional therapy. But as I mentioned previously, this was a post hoc analysis and there were inconsistent trends in this analysis. So it should not be used to make definitive treatment decisions. So in summation for remdesivir, it does significantly reduce, or it demonstrates a significant reduction in clinical recovery, which in essence is the time it takes for patients to be discharged or be dischargeable, barring infection control considerations. There's a clinically meaningful but not statistically significant reduction in mortality seen in the overall population in the Act 1 trial. And then the sum total of the data are not supportive of a hard 10-day cutoff for symptom onset. Additionally, in patients who do derive benefit from therapy, it appears that 5 days is equally efficacious as 10 days of therapy, which has significant implications in our current landscape with limited supply. And lastly, serious and non-serious adverse events have been observed at similar or lower rates than placebo in our controlled trials, confirming that remdesivir is generally well tolerated overall. So these were just 2 trials that have been published, but as you're all aware, there are several studies that are being generated. Here are a few of the current investigations that are underway or are in the process of being published. Here are my references, and then please do not hesitate to reach out for any questions you might have after this presentation. Obviously, we'll be doing a few Q&As here.
Thank you very much, Matt. This is Chuck McKay. Why don't we go ahead and start with some of the QAs? I'll start with Dr. Dahl in order to give people a little more time to put some questions into the queue for Dr. Davis as well. Dr. Dahl, there are several questions that really focus on some of the issues you talked about as potential caveats, I think, to the using the data across different countries or even over different times frames since this epidemic has started. And let me just give you a couple of those and have you respond to those. One of those is that how is a question on your statement about there being an underestimation of the excess deaths. And the questioner is specifically asking here that when, if a person is positive, tests positive for COVID-19, they may have their death attributed to that, even if there are other explanations. They specifically mention things like trauma, MI, stroke, other kind of things, where they may be attributed to a COVID infection, while there may be a different actual etiology. How would you respond to that question?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I heard variations on that previously. So that is possible, and a lot of it also just depends on the surveillance system and how this is being reported. And I think some of our data that we've seen, one reason why we look at maybe excess mortality is because a lot of that was happening before there was a really good surveillance system in place for COVID. And so where maybe things had been attributed to other diseases. Regarding trauma, it is possible. Again, it would depend a little bit on the reporting. And one thing, at least we've seen in the US, is that different states are reporting at different levels and are sometimes have been using different case definitions. And so I think over the last several months, we're trying to tighten up the definition so that people are being more consistent, so that we can use that, I guess, a little bit more uniformly. I think there's been maybe a couple cases that gained some media attention where maybe someone died in a car accident and it was trauma, and then somehow that ended up as reported as COVID. So I think that is probably more the exception than the rule. But you could also, in the trauma accident example, and that they could also have had a role. And if someone is incapacitated and they're driving and they have an accident that they would not have had if they had not been infected with COVID, that could also have a factor. But again, I think those cases are probably more the exception than the rule.
Okay. Well, thank you. And actually, you did mention within that your presentation, and actually that answer you just gave about the excess mortality curves. Is that would that be considered maybe a rough gauge, but an independent predictor of attributable or likely attributable mortality, because it doesn't depend on testing, which, as you mentioned, is so variable either during a given time frame or location within the world?
Yeah, I think one reason why some of these analyses were being done is because either because of the lack of testing, and especially with a novel disease, and there's not always surveillance systems in place for it. One reason why we wanted to use the influenza comparison is because there's been quite a bit invested in influenza surveillance. The timing was also, I guess we were in, at least in the Northern Hemisphere, in the influenza season when this was first discovered, first noticed. And so I think it gave us a proxy. I think in a lot of the countries, we do have like trend over time, and it's probably reliable. You might not see large spikes in deaths unless it was attributable to something else. I think one reason why we also wanted to show the example from one of the lower resource countries is you don't always have that information, at least maybe at a national level. But I think looking at mortality surveillance is something that public health officials have been trying to improve upon for a long time. And that's one reason, I guess, from the Zambia example. Again, that was limited to the capital, but I think they've realized that if we're going to be detecting a new disease, a new pathogen, having a mortality surveillance would give us at least maybe a window into that before we might be able to identify what the new pathogen is.
Mm-hmm. In the one question that's come in is in regards to maybe the finer level of analysis of mortality data. Have you been able to pick up, or are you looking for excess overdose or suicide mortality, either within the time frame or attributable to the epidemic itself?
That's a great question. Since I'm mostly focused on the international aspect of that, we don't always have that maybe granular data in what we're able to look at. So that could be a challenge, but it is also something I can definitely check back with colleagues and see if they're looking at that in the U.S. But at least from what we're looking at, we haven't been able to really pick that up. But it's a great question.
And sticking then at the international level, do you have, confidence, would be a word, in terms of consistency of reporting, maybe not between countries, but within a country, so that the graph that you showed about mitigation strategies and tempo of the curve, that will be consistent within a country, or are there still some significant concerns about the data integrity or caveats to its interpretation?
No, again, that's a great question. It is something we definitely look at, and due to time limitations, I wasn't able to get into all the analyses that we have done or are doing, but we are looking at that because we know that maybe, especially in a more resource-limited country, that maybe the detection in the capital city or the more affluent parts of the country would be stronger than in another part of the country. We've been doing some recent analyses, I say, from looking at South America, where we are seeing differences in reporting from the capital cities versus, say, the Amazon regions, and looking at trying to dig a little deeper, not just about the reporting, but what's expected, but also, are we seeing maybe more reports in a certain area that might overestimate it because they've improved their surveillance, versus areas where maybe there's silent zones. And so I think, yes, we definitely see a whole range. And definitely in some countries, we're quite confident with the data that's coming out. Others, just based on previous work in the international setting, we know that there can be a huge range in the quality of data. Over.
Okay. Well, thank you. There's a question here about Israel and some of the school startup questions. This one is, didn't Israel start out with a return by school by grade and then have pressure to bring all the grades back and then have associated outbreaks in that setting?
Yeah, again, due to time limitations, I wasn't able to really get into all those details. But Israel is probably from this countries that have had school reopenings. They're probably the ones that have had the largest outbreaks. I was just in a meeting this morning, a presentation this morning from that region, and in many of the European countries, the outbreaks have been relatively small, relatively limited in nature, but Israel has had some very well-documented larger outbreaks that have then led to ongoing infection in the community, and currently is probably the reason why Israel is having an uptick in cases nationally. So it's a great example, and a great someone that is reading the news in your audience.
And then jumping a little bit away from there, since we have, I guess, the longest period of time with potential ramifications in China, can you provide information about regions or, I guess, regional areas within China with what's gone on there in terms of deaths, cases, or the results of any mitigation measures? A large question of a couple billion people to be answered in a short way.
So there was a recent outbreak in Beijing associated with another open air market, a seafood market or food market. And the mitigation techniques that were put into place right after that, and they closed the market, they locked down the neighborhoods around there and did hard scale contact tracing. And it does seem to be under control. There's probably, and again, caveats about the data and do we have access to the data or confidence in the data, but it did seem that outbreak did not take off like the Wuhan outbreak did prior.
Okay. Well, thank you, and I know we've held you tight on time because of the time limitations here. We do have a number of questions that have come in on for Dr. Davis as well, and some that may be applicable to either of you. So let me just turn the moderation of those questions over to Dr. Wax now to handle, and I'll take a look through for some additional ones before we close. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Dr. McKay. I actually have one additional question for Dr. Dahl, which is, as you look at the curve with the U.S. versus Europe, we've all seen those curves every night now. What other country probably best models what's happened in the U.S.? If you look at the U.S. going up, to the apex in April and plateauing, coming down a bit, and then going way up currently, could you compare the U.S. to some other kind of comparable country with a similar curve?
Probably Brazil would be my initial take on that. Again, I guess I would wonder if we actually really did plateau in April, but that there were rumors of that. But I would say Brazil's probably been the most comparable country, just based on the number of cases and how they continue to climb.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so I will turn this over to Dr. Davis. A bunch of questions. Well, first question is, how long does it take for Remdesivir to be fully FDA approved? What is Remdesivir is still at emergency use authorization status, and is it going before them for full approval at this point?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, that's a great question, and unfortunately, I don't have a good answer for it. I think the answer probably is soon. I would imagine with the kind of shifting of donated supply to now a commercially available supply for Remdesivir. I think we're kind of in this intermediate state right now where we can actually purchase Remdesivir, although it is kind of contingent upon what you're allocated to be allowed to purchase. But presumably they'll be sitting for an NDA very soon if they are not already doing that. But I don't know of any more updated information than that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another question is about when you're looking at adverse drug events potentially, and the fact that Remdesivir has also occasionally been associated with liver and renal abnormalities, and so does the underlying disease process of COVID-19. Are there any pearls about separating, tweezing out, what might be from the Remdesivir versus the underlying disease?
That's a great question on a lot of folks' minds. I think the best thing that we can do is just look at what's published so far. So I think prior to the Act 1 study, we were seeing a lot of uncontrolled data and just phase 1 data, and we didn't really know what the actual clinical impact of Remdesivir on transaminitis or AKI rates. With that placebo-controlled trial, we actually have good safety data to suggest that really it might not be as much of a consideration as we had previously thought. I would say that the AKI risk is really driven by the cyclodextrin in it, and clinically, it might not be as problematic as the trials would have you believe. So the trials all use pretty conservative cutoffs for enrollment, and that's really a safety issue for just for sponsor considerations. But realistically, in clinical practice, I think a lot of clinicians are much less concerned about cyclodextrin and its impact on AKI risks. So I would still advise folks to kind of consult with the EUA documents and the FDA guidance, and obviously weigh risk benefits. But it does appear with the placebo-controlled data that Remdesivir is well tolerated, and I think probably benefits outweigh risks for the majority of patients.
Great, thank you. Another question, which you may have been asked before with other conditions and all, but you presented two studies. One was funded by the NIH, and the other was funded by the drug manufacturer. In terms of interpreting the data, how should one approach the fact that one is actually funded by the developer versus the more perhaps independent funding from the government?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that we've all been very cautious with, especially with kind of just the overwhelming amount of information and just trying to make sure that nothing gets missed in interpretation. I would say that really the group that published the Act 1 study, very well respected. As a placebo-controlled trial, is independent of sponsor involvement. So that data is reliable, and we're very anxiously awaiting the final publication for the full 28-day follow-up period. So that one reliable, and I would just I would read it and just read it thoroughly and just make sure that you are kind of interpreting everything in the context of the constraints of the trial itself. For the simple one study for the severe patients, that actually, kind of paradoxically works against Gilead's interest, because they effectively equated 5 days of therapy for 10 days of therapy. The one caveat being that post-hoc analysis, where they really kind of tried to suggest that patients who were mechanically ventilated or on ECMO at day 5, might have had a lower mortality rate by day 14 if they received 5 additional days of therapy. I do caution, readers and listeners for interpreting too much from that analysis, because there are just several limitations with conducting, a post-hoc analysis on a very small subgroup of a small trial already, and you're effectively breaking your randomization when you're analyzing patients with your time 0 starting at day 5. So I would kind of interpret some of the Gilead sponsored data with a little bit more caution. They recently actually published or had a press release where they analyzed mortality compared to an external cohort, and that one has kind of raised a little bit of concern. There's a theory that they're feeling a little bit of pressure with the recovery data coming out, and also the price tag of remdesivir being relatively high. Now they need to justify the expense with some mortality benefit, and that wasn't observed in the day 14 mortality, at least in a statistically significant fashion from the Act 1 trial. So that I would interpret cautiously. I would really like to see full analysis before really interpreting too far into that.
Okay, great. Thank you. Another couple of questions. The Society of Critical Care Medicine back in March, which was a lifetime ago, but they did not at that point recommend remdesivir therapy as part of their guideline. Are you familiar with any organizations that have now best published the most current COVID treatment guidelines?
Yeah, so the IDSA actually does recommend remdesivir therapy. They have several tiered recommendations based on the quality of evidence to support it in various subgroups. They recommend 5 days for the majority of patients, potentially 10 days for mechanically ventilated patients because of kind of the limitations of the simple severe study, predominantly because they excluded mechanically ventilated and ECMO patients at baseline, although some patients, as I mentioned, did make it into the study. So now it is recommended and is considered, it is considered standard of care, and that's kind of what led to the EUA approval.
Okay, great. And let me just see another question about the logistics of dispensing remdesivir, particularly in terms of the scarcity of it in some locations and whether it can be shipped across lines for dispensing. Do you have any additional information about special situations where it's easier to get the remdesivir now than it might have been a few weeks ago?
I'm sorry, could you, I think my audio cut in and cut out a little bit. Could you just repeat the last part of it?
It's basically about the scarcity of the remdesivir, and are there any pearls about trying to procure the remdesivir if your health system is running out of it?
Oh yeah, that is obviously top of mind for everybody right now. I think the best thing is just to ensure that you have all the avenues set up for purchase through AmerisourceBergen. Commercial availability and the ability to purchase it should be live, and will be live very soon. It's really going to be contingent upon your current census, the amount of suspected cases you have, and then also your utilization of Remdesivir in general. And I would just ensure that you are equipped and are already reporting your data daily through the teletracking portal, just to ensure that you don't miss any allocations or the opportunity to purchase Remdesivir.
Okay, great. Thank you. I think I'll turn it back over to Dr. McKay. There were a couple of additional questions for Dr. Dahl about school openings, I think, and camps.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Wax. Dr. Dahl, there have been a few questions coming in about specific regions and their experience. And I'll ask you those. I was just wondering, though, for people who have specific interest, is there a single site where the data that you're developing, accumulating, it could be found that's being updated?
Yeah, I guess we're pulling data from a number of sources. A lot of the global data is being pulled from the WHO. One of the things I cited was also some of the work that Johns Hopkins is doing. And then from the CDC side, I'll have to get you the exact web address, but we are also putting a lot of this out there.
Okay. All right. If you could provide that to us, we'll post that for people's use. That would be useful. One of the questions, and I went back to look at your slides, and I could not see in, I believe it was slides 14 and 15, where you have the incidence rates and the age and the spheres and the movement across the X and Y axis. Somebody had asked, how does community level spread in Israel compare with the United States, and therefore can we predict anything about school outbreaks, say in Israel compared with what may happen in the U.S.? And another question kind of related to that is, do you anticipate, given your experience thus far, that as schools and camps do open, that there will be outbreaks here in the U.S.?
Yeah, great questions. For Israel, they had more or less controlled the outbreak. They were definitely one of the countries that had incidence below 50% before they reopened the schools. So they were at a very low level. They had done, I think, a very fine job initially. But then they have seen this uptick since then. So I won't say that they're an outlier, because they were following the same model for containment that others in the European region have done, and then they've seen cases. So I think there are potentially some examples for how would that equate to the U.S. Well, I think when they reopened their schools, they were at a much lower level of community transmission than we are here currently. So I will have to see about that, and the number of countries that have reopened schools during this, it's still relatively small. So I think that's one reason why we're trying to learn from it, as most of our schools have been closed. Regarding transmission, when we're opening camps or schools again, and we generally try to avoid making predictions or guesses on that, but I think what we have seen is that when you do have community transmission, then you can have ongoing transmission to some of those populations. But for example, the results we saw out of Europe, where maybe Eastern Europe, where maybe not as many countries had achieved that 50% reduction, there were mixed results. That could also be a surveillance artifact. It could be that we're a little bit early, but I think that would be probably something that we want to continue to monitor.
Okay. And then I'll close the Q&A session with just one that I'm not sure you can answer, but do you have an opinion or a concern regarding the recent switch or reportive switch in how the data is being sent, I guess, in from the U.S. data going to HHS as opposed to CDC within HHS.
Yeah, so, and this would be my personal opinion. I'm not expressing the agency opinion on this, but personally, I think there could be some challenges there, and I think we'll have to see, since this is just being implemented right now. We'll have to see if we have the same level of access to the data or what happens going forward. We want to make sure that the decisions are moving forward for hospitals are data driven, and that we are able to respond to the questions that they're asking. But it's probably a little too early to tell like what access and what level of data analysis will be happening with this new policy.
All right, well, thank you for that. I'd like to thank both our speakers, and Paul, I'd like to turn it back over to you to close out the program for this webinar. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Next slide. So again, this webinar will be posted on the ACMT website, not only the webinar itself, but also a PDF of the slide set. And that should be available sometime on Friday, and you'll get an email to that effect. The website again is acmt.net/COVID-19 web. Next slide. We're going to be continuing a weekly webinar series. Next Wednesday, we're going to have a presentation about antibody testing. Earlier in this series, we did something specifically about the PCR testing, but this will be concentrated on the antibody testing. A lot of folks are obviously quite interested in this and its reliability, accessibility, and what it actually tells us. So we're going to have a presentation on the do's and don'ts of antibody testing, and then we're going to have an update, another international update next week from Nepal. So that's Wednesday, July 22nd at 3 p.m. Eastern Time. Thank you very much for attending, and have a good day.